Hey everyone, it's Ben Hardy here, and in today's going to be talking about the Hyundai Motor Company. So this is going to include talks about Hyundai, Kia, and Genesis. Before we get in this video though, as always, if you're going to save time and money the next time you purchase a car, link to my car buying guide in the description down below. And a lot of the information in today's video comes from Cox Automotive. Let's get into it. So Hyundai just had a really solid sales quarter. All three brands combined sold over 437,000 units. This is an increase of 15% year over year, which actually lags behind the rest of the car industry, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more later. If you don't know, the average increase year over year for most brands is about 17%. Now, if we break the brands up, starting with the Hyundai brand, they sold over 210,000 vehicles. This is an increase of 14% year over year. The vehicles that did really well, Hyundai Elantra had a 58% increase year over year. The Tucson was up by 23%. So those both above the, obviously, Hyundai's average, but also the market average as well. But interestingly enough, Santa Fe, Kona, and Santa Cruz had much smaller increases year over year, and then the Palisade was actually down by 12%, which is pretty interesting because we just got like a refresh on the Palisade, so it's interesting that people are pulling back from that. Now, if we dive over into the Kia side of things, they sold about 210,000 units, just like the Hyundai brand, but actually just slightly more units, which is interesting because if you look at the day supply number with the Kia brand, there's like no inventory with Kia dealerships, whereas Hyundai dealerships have quite a bit more inventory, but they sold about the same amount of cars. But year over year increase, again, 15%, just like the Hyundai brand. So Sportage lagged behind that, 12% increase. Forte, 11% increase. Telluride had a 13% increase, which is interesting because the Telluride, again, is a sibling vehicle to the Palisade, so you think that they both have increases, but Palisade down, Telluride up when it comes to sales. Now, the vehicle that did the best for them was the Seltos, 114% increase year over year, which is pretty crazy. Now, when you dive into the Genesis brand, Genesis is doing amazingly well. It's actually outpacing the rest of the Hyundai Motor Company, 25% increase year over year. And it's the only brand that actually had a market share increase as well year over year. So the GV70, which is the brand's best seller, is up by 55%. GV60 and G90 also had big increases. The G90, 247% increase, which is crazy. The GV80, however, was down by about 1%, which I find interesting. So if you look at, again, combine all of the brands together, their market share was 10.6%, which is a slight decrease compared to what we saw last year. Now, when we dive into incentives, Hyundai Motor Company is spending more on incentives. The average incentive spend is $1,330, which is below the industry average of over $2,000 per vehicle. So although they did increase their incentive spend, they're still well below industry average. And again, it is going to vary brand by brand. For example, Kia, for example, is spending about $1,000 per vehicle. So Kia is spending less than what the rest of the brands are. And then Hyundai is spending $1,400 per vehicle. So Hyundai is spending more than Kia, which makes sense. Kia has no inventory. Hyundai has a lot of inventory. Genesis is spending the most, though, $3,400 per vehicle. Now, obviously, Genesis is a smaller brand in terms of volume. I mean, last quarter, in terms of sales figures, 17,000 vehicles. So that's why their incentive spend their massive incentive spend doesn't bring up the whole number by as much because, again, the volume with that brand is quite a bit lower. Now, I usually don't talk about average transaction price with different brands, but we are going to talk about it with Hyundai Motor Company. The average transaction price is just over $36,000, which puts them well below the industry average of closer to $50,000. And so, again, I think that's part of the reason why it's helping these brands do so well. So if you look at Hyundai, $35,500, Kia, $35,300, and then Genesis is just over $62,000 for their average transaction price. Again, it makes sense. They are the luxury offshoot. And so now let's kind of dive into my thoughts with what is happening with the Hyundai Motor Company. And I actually just want to dive into each of the brands because I think that'll be easier. So with the Hyundai brand, what I've kind of discovered, and I'd recommend you do your own research on this particular topic, but what I've discovered is that it's actually the brand that gets the most love, right? Because what essentially, and when I say the most love, it gets the most parts. It has the best production capability out of all three brands. And that's because Hyundai has the most control of that brand. The Kia brand, on the other hand, right, Hyundai obviously still has a stake in that brand, but it's not like they completely own the brand, if that makes sense. And so when it comes to producing vehicles, like let's say that they have materials to produce a Hyundai or a Kia, Hyundai's obviously going to, you know, want to produce their vehicles over Kia's vehicles, right? Kia kind of has to figure out their own thing. And so I think that's a big, at least from the research I've done, that's a big part of the reason why Kia has so little inventory, but then their sales are about the same as Hyundai's, right? It's basically, it looks like they're just giving enough materials for Kia to sell just enough, right? And then if they have any extra materials, it all goes towards the Hyundai brand. And, you know, I'm not going to say whether or not this is a good business decision, but what I am going to say is I don't necessarily think that it's helping the image of Hyundai, because, again, with a massive amount of inventory, people assume that there's going to be higher discounts, so the profitability is going to continue to go down. And, again, when the sales figures are the same between the two brands, why build more on one brand? I don't know. That's just kind of my thoughts on it. Let me know what you guys think about that whole situation. But I think that we're just going to continue to see that trend moving forward, where we're going to see tons of Hyundais getting built, not as many Kias. That brand is always going to kind of stay more constrained compared to the Hyundai brand. Now, on the Genesis side of things, I mean, they're killing it. Like, they are selling so many cars, and they are one of the few luxury brands that's actually doing well in today's market. There's been a big pullback from luxury cars, but Genesis is still selling quite well. And so I see that trend continuing, because what they're offering is a luxury car experience. And, you know, obviously that average transaction price is pretty close to the average price of a luxury car. You know, the average price of a luxury car is like $67,000, $68,000. But I mean, you still look at the features and the options you get in Genesis cars compared to other luxury cars in the market, and the value proposition is just so much stronger. And so I think they're going to continue to eat up more and more market share, and they are just pretty much like going to be just another one of the major luxury players here in the US market, which is crazy because it is such a new brand. And so when you put all of this together, it makes sense as to why, you know, the Hyundai Motor Company is now one of the biggest car companies here in the US. And, you know, I think that there is potential that they might get knocked down a little bit in the future in terms of their placing, but at the same time, there's a lot of really cool releases coming out soon. You know, Kia has the new EV9, which is an electric crossover. I know some of you don't like electric cars, but electric crossover, 3-row, right? And then you've got the new Santa Fe, which has this cool boxy design. And so they just got a lot of exciting vehicles, exciting to people that just like to drive normal cars, that is, that are coming out that I think could sell in pretty high volume amounts that could, you know, help them out with staying in the place that they're at. And then the last thing I'm going to mention before we cap off this video, part of the reason why I think that the whole company went down a little bit in market share is partially with Honda and Toyota slowly ramping up their production. I think there's a lot of people that went to Hyundai and Kia because they couldn't get a Honda or Toyota, but now that you can get from those manufacturers, I think there is some people kind of moving away. Let me know your thoughts on that. I have to do a little bit more research. That's why I left that point at the end of the video, but anyways, I'll see you.